April 4, 1945, Western Germany. The radio in a field hospital crackled with reports of American advances. Outside, canvas tents flapped in the cold wind. Inside, medics worked under kerosene lamps, their hands covered in blood, both American and German. Captured Wehrmacht soldiers lay on stretchers, eyes wide with disbelief. They had been taught that Americans showed no mercy. Nazi propaganda promised brutal treatment for prisoners, yet here they were, receiving morphine, bandages, surgical care. One German sergeant, wounded in the abdomen, whispered to a comrade, "Why do they save us?" The American medic, tired and silent, simply continued his work. Commanders had expected resistance to continue, but the reports soon showed something unexpected. Thousands of German soldiers were surrendering, knowing they would receive medical treatment rather than execution. From this moment began a story that would reshape post-war reconciliation. April 1945 marked the final collapse of Nazi Germany. American forces had crossed the Rhine in March and now drove deep into the German heartland. The Wehrmacht, once considered the most formidable military machine in Europe, was disintegrating. Divisions existed only on paper. Supply lines had vanished, fuel stocks were exhausted, ammunition depots lay empty or destroyed by Allied bombing. The contrast between the two armies was absolute. American forces advanced with mechanized infantry, supported by endless columns of trucks carrying food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The Third Army alone operated more than 15,000 vehicles. Behind the front lines, a sophisticated logistics network ensured that wounded soldiers reached field hospitals within hours. German forces, by comparison, moved on foot, horses pulled artillery pieces, soldiers scavenged for food in abandoned villages, medical supplies were nearly non-existent, wounded men were left behind during retreats with no hope of treatment. The German medical system, once efficient, had collapsed under the weight of casualties and the destruction of infrastructure. American intelligence estimated that German forces in the West numbered approximately 400,000 men. However, combat effectiveness was minimal. Many units consisted of old men and young boys, conscripted in desperation. Officers knew the war was lost. The question was not whether Germany would be defeated, but how many would die before the end. The United States Army Medical Corps had prepared for this final phase. More than 1,000 mobile field hospitals were positioned across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. Each hospital contained surgical teams, nurses, and enough supplies to treat hundreds of casualties. The medical system was designed to save lives efficiently, processing wounded men from battlefield to hospital to evacuation in a matter of hours. But in April 1945, a new challenge emerged. As German forces surrendered in massive numbers, thousands of wounded enemy soldiers required medical attention. American medics faced a decision that would test their professional ethics and humanity. March 1945, a field hospital in Belgium. Snow still covered the ground, though spring was approaching. Inside a large tent, Captain Robert Wilson briefed his medical staff. The topic was not surgery or triage procedures, it was ethics. "We treat all wounded," Wilson said. "American, British, German. It doesn't matter. Our job is to save lives." This philosophy was not new. The United States Army Medical Corps had established clear guidelines based on the Geneva Convention of 1929. Medical personnel were required to provide care to all wounded soldiers, regardless of nationality. The principle was simple. On the operating table, there were no enemies, only patients. The Medical Corps had developed this approach through years of experience. Since the North African Campaign of 1942, American medics had treated thousands of enemy wounded. Italian soldiers, German Afrika Korps troops, even captured SS personnel, all received the same standard of care as American soldiers. This policy was not motivated by sentiment. It was practical, professional, and legally mandated. Training emphasized this principle repeatedly. Medical school graduates entering military service learned that their Hippocratic oath did not cease during wartime. Medics and corpsmen, many of whom had no prior medical education, were taught to provide first aid to any wounded person. Field manuals explicitly stated that enemy wounded must be collected, treated, and evacuated alongside friendly casualties. The statistics demonstrated the scope of this policy. By early 1945, American field hospitals in Europe had treated more than 40,000 enemy prisoners of war. The 12th Field Hospital alone processed over 3,000 German casualties between January and March. The 14th Field Hospital reported similar numbers. These facilities operated with the same efficiency for enemy wounded as for American casualties. Medical officers understood the practical benefits. Treated prisoners were less likely to die from infection or complications. This reduced the burden on already strained German civilian medical facilities. It also prevented disease outbreaks that could spread to Allied forces. Moreover, well-treated prisoners provided valuable intelligence and were more cooperative during interrogation. But beyond practicality lay something deeper. American medics believed in their professional duty. They had sworn to heal, not to judge. In field hospitals across Europe, this belief would be tested as never before. April 1945, a forest road in western Germany, Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt lay in a ditch, bleeding from shrapnel wounds to his leg and shoulder. His unit had been overrun by American armor that morning. Now he was alone, unable to walk, waiting for either death or capture. Schmidt had been in the Wehrmacht since 1939. He had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He knew what happened to prisoners on the Eastern Front. The Soviets showed no mercy. Captured Germans were shot, worked to death, or left to die of their wounds. Nazi propaganda reinforced this belief about all Allied forces. Surrender meant torture and execution, but the Western Allies were different, though Schmidt did not know this yet. When American infantrymen found him 2 hours later, he expected the worst. Instead, a medic knelt beside him, examined his wounds, and called for a stretcher. Schmidt tried to speak, to ask what would happen, but the medic simply said, "You're going to be okay, buddy." This experience was repeated thousands of times across Germany in April 1945. German soldiers, indoctrinated by years of propaganda, expected brutal treatment. They had been told that Americans were gangsters, criminals, interested only in revenge. The reality shocked them. Wehrmacht training manuals advised soldiers to fight to the death rather than surrender. Capture meant dishonor and certain death, according to Nazi ideology. Officers were instructed to shoot deserters and defeatists. The regime's propaganda apparatus had spent years portraying the enemy as inhuman monsters. Reports from German units show the depth of this indoctrination. A captured Wehrmacht major, interrogated in March 1945, admitted he had ordered his men to fight until ammunition was exhausted because he believed surrender meant execution. A German medic, interviewed after the war, stated that he expected American soldiers to shoot wounded prisoners on sight. The contrast between expectation and reality would prove decisive in the final weeks of the war. As word spread among German forces that Americans treated prisoners humanely, surrender rates increased dramatically. Entire units began laying down their arms. The professional conduct of American medics became a weapon more powerful than artillery, a demonstration that the Allied cause was just and that Nazi propaganda had been lies. April 1945. Behind the American front lines, a vast medical infrastructure operated with industrial efficiency. This system was the product of years of planning and billions of dollars in investment. It represented American organizational genius and manufacturing capacity applied to the problem of saving lives. The foundation was mobility. Field hospitals were not fixed installations but mobile units that could pack up and move in hours. Each hospital consisted of dozens of large tents, portable surgical equipment, generators for electricity, and vehicles for transportation. The 45th Field Hospital, typical of these units, could accommodate 400 patients and perform major surgery in battlefield conditions. Supply lines were the key to success. From ports in France and Belgium, truck convoys delivered medical supplies daily to forward hospitals. Plasma, morphine, sulfur drugs, bandages, surgical instruments, all arrived in standardized packs designed for rapid deployment. The medical supply depot in Paris processed more than 50,000 supply requests per month, ensuring that no hospital ran short of critical materials. Evacuation procedures were equally sophisticated. Wounded men were collected by battalion aid stations within minutes of being hit. Ambulances, often modified jeeps or trucks, transported them to collecting stations. From there, larger ambulances carried them to field hospitals where surgery could be performed. The entire process, from wounding to operating table, averaged 4 to 6 hours. In World War I, the same journey had taken days. Air evacuation added another dimension. C-47 transport aircraft, converted into flying ambulances, could evacuate seriously wounded men from forward airfields to rear area hospitals in France or even England. By April 1945, more than 200,000 casualties had been evacuated by air. This capability saved thousands of lives by getting critical patients to specialized care quickly. The system processed staggering numbers. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945, American field hospitals treated more than 80,000 casualties in 6 weeks. The system never broke down. No hospital was overwhelmed. No patient was denied treatment due to lack of supplies or personnel. This same system now confronted an unexpected challenge. As German forces surrendered en masse, thousands of enemy wounded required the same level of care. The medical corps would prove that its capacity was sufficient for both friend and foe. April 10, 1945. The 67th Field Hospital, located in a former German barracks near Kassel. Trucks arrived every few hours carrying both American and German wounded. Medics separated them into two groups, but only for administrative purposes. Medical treatment was identical. Captain James Morrison, the hospital's chief surgeon, worked 16-hour shifts. He performed amputations, removed shrapnel, repaired organs damaged by bullets and shell fragments. When a German soldier arrived on his table, Morrison treated him exactly as he would an American. "I don't ask who they are," he later wrote in his diary. "I ask what's wrong with them." The numbers were extraordinary. During the second week of April, the 67th Hospital admitted 460 patients. 173 were German prisoners of war. All received surgery when needed. All received morphine for pain. All were fed the same rations as American patients. The mortality rate for German POWs treated at American hospitals was approximately 3%, comparable to the rate for American casualties. German prisoners expressed shock at their treatment. A Waffen-SS sergeant, wounded in both legs, told an interpreter, "I thought you would let us die. This is not what we were told." A young Wehrmacht private, no more than 17 years old, cried when he realized he would survive his wounds. An older Luftwaffe officer, a veteran of the Russian front, simply said, "Thank you, you are good men." These reactions were documented by American medical personnel and military intelligence officers who interviewed recovering prisoners. The reports were consistent. German soldiers had expected death or brutal mistreatment. Instead, they received professional medical care that was often superior to what German military hospitals had provided earlier in the war. The psychological impact was significant. Prisoners who recovered at American hospitals were cooperative and forthcoming during interrogation. Many provided valuable intelligence about German defensive positions, unit locations, and morale. Some expressed willingness to work as interpreters or laborers. The humanitarian treatment generated goodwill that had strategic value. But for the medics and doctors, the motivation was not strategic. It was professional. They had been trained to save lives. In the operating tents of field hospitals across Germany, that mission continued regardless of nationality, ideology, or politics. April 15, 1945. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Reims, France. Staff officers reviewed reports from forward medical units. The data revealed an unexpected development. The treatment of German wounded was accelerating the collapse of enemy resistance. The numbers told the story. In the first 2 weeks of April, American forces captured more than 150,000 German soldiers. Approximately 15,000 required immediate medical treatment for combat wounds. All were processed through the field hospital system. Word of this treatment spread rapidly through German units still in the field. Intelligence reports documented the effect. Intercepted radio messages showed German officers discussing American treatment of prisoners. Some units radioed headquarters, specifically asking whether surrender was advisable given the humanitarian treatment of POWs. Frontline troops told interrogators they had surrendered because they knew they would be treated fairly, especially if wounded. This represented a significant strategic advantage. Every German soldier who surrendered was a soldier who no longer fought. Every unit that laid down arms was a unit that required no further combat to defeat. The humanitarian treatment of prisoners accelerated the war's end, saving American lives in the process. But there were costs. Medical supplies allocated to treat German wounded could not be used for American casualties. Hospital beds occupied by prisoners were not available for American soldiers. Transportation used to evacuate German POWs could not simultaneously evacuate American wounded. These were real limitations that affected operations. Medical Corps leadership addressed these concerns directly. Colonel James Kimbrough, Chief Surgeon of the First Army, issued a memorandum in mid-April stating, "Treatment of enemy wounded is not only a legal obligation under the Geneva Convention, but a practical necessity. Untreated prisoners spread disease, require guards and resources, and provide propaganda opportunities to the enemy. Properly treated prisoners are healthy, cooperative, and represent no threat to our forces." The statistics supported this assessment. The cost of treating German wounded was minimal compared to overall medical expenditures. By mid-April, less than 5% of medical supplies went to treating enemy casualties. The strategic benefits, accelerated surrender, improved intelligence, reduced resistance, far outweighed the costs. American medics did not make these calculations. They treated wounded because that was their job. But military planners recognized that mercy and military advantage were not contradictory. In the chaotic final weeks of the European war, humanity proved to be both morally right and strategically wise. April 20th, 1945. A recovery ward in a field hospital near Frankfurt. 20 German soldiers lay in beds, recovering from surgery and wounds. Some had lost limbs, others bore scars from shrapnel and bullets. All were alive because of American medical care. Unteroffizier Karl Weber had been wounded during an American artillery barrage. Shrapnel had torn through his right arm and chest. He remembered the moment of capture vividly. American soldiers had found him unconscious in a shell crater. When he woke, he was in a hospital bed. His arm was bandaged. An IV drip delivered fluids and medication. An American nurse checked his pulse and temperature. "I thought it was a dream," Weber later told an interpreter. "In Russia, wounded prisoners were left to die. Here they saved my life." This transformation from enemy to patient affected every German POW who received treatment. The experience contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. Americans were not barbaric criminals. They were professional, efficient, and humane. The contrast with Eastern Front conditions was absolute and undeniable. Gefreiter Otto Schneider, 19 years old, had surrendered with his entire company in early April. Wounded in the leg, he expected to be shot. Instead, he received surgery, antibiotics, and 3 meals a day. "I could not believe it," he wrote in a letter to his mother after the war. "They treated us like human beings, not like animals." The psychological impact extended beyond individual prisoners. As recovered POWs were transferred to permanent camps, they spread word of their treatment. Letters to families in Germany described American fairness and professionalism. After the war, these accounts influenced German public opinion about the American occupation. Statistics documented the scope of this transformation. By war's end in May 1945, American forces had captured over 3 million German soldiers. Approximately 150,000 received medical treatment in American field hospitals. Post-war surveys showed that former POWs who had been medically treated by Americans held significantly more favorable views of the United States than those who had not. The long-term effects would shape post-war Germany. Former Wehrmacht soldiers, who had experienced American medical care, became advocates for cooperation with Allied occupation authorities. Their testimony helped counter Soviet propaganda and contributed to the rehabilitation of West German society. The mercy shown in April 1945 planted seeds that would grow into the German-American alliance of the Cold War era. April 25, 1945, the Elbe River. American and Soviet forces met, cutting Germany in half. Thousands of German soldiers fled westward, desperate to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. Among them were many wounded men who had heard about American medical treatment. The flood of surrenders overwhelmed processing capabilities. Entire divisions laid down arms. In some cases, German officers formally surrendered their units in organized ceremonies. In others, individual soldiers simply walked toward American lines with hands raised. All knew that capture by Americans meant survival. Military intelligence documented this phenomenon. Reports from interrogation centers showed that treatment of wounded was a significant factor in surrender decisions. A German regimental commander, captured on April 23rd, stated explicitly, "My men knew that if they were wounded and captured by Americans, they would be treated. This knowledge made surrender acceptable." The contrast with the Eastern Front was stark and deliberate. German soldiers who fought against Soviet forces had no illusion about their fate if captured. Soviet treatment of prisoners was harsh, often brutal. Millions of German POWs would die in Soviet captivity. German soldiers knew this and fought desperately to avoid capture by the Red Army. But American treatment created a different dynamic. When German soldiers knew they would be treated humanely, resistance became pointless. Why die defending a lost cause when surrender meant medical care, food, and eventual repatriation? The calculus was simple and compelling. The numbers reflected this reality. In the final 3 weeks of April 1945, American forces in Germany captured more than 800,000 prisoners. Soviet forces fighting much larger German formations captured fewer prisoners because Germans fought harder to avoid Soviet capture. The humanitarian treatment of prisoners by American forces thus became a military asset that saved American lives by reducing the intensity of German resistance. Field hospitals continued to function at full capacity. The 42nd Field Hospital, operating near Leipzig, treated more than 600 German wounded in the last week of April. The 91st Field Hospital processed over 400 German casualties. Every major American medical facility in Germany reported similar numbers. The system strained but never broke. By the end of April, the war's outcome was certain. Germany would surrender within days. But in field hospitals across the former Reich, American medics continued their work. They treated wounds, performed surgery, saved lives. They did not calculate strategic advantage or political benefit. They simply fulfilled their professional duty and, in doing so, demonstrated the moral superiority of the Allied cause. April 28, 1945, 3rd Army Intelligence Section, Bavaria. Major William Hendricks reviewed interrogation reports from recovered German POWs. The information they provided was extraordinary, not because of its military value, which was minimal at this stage of the war, but because of what it revealed about German perceptions. Prisoners who had been medically treated were remarkably forthcoming. They answered questions willingly, provided detailed information about their units, and expressed gratitude for their treatment. Many volunteered information without prompting. A Luftwaffe pilot, recovering from burns at an American hospital, drew detailed maps of German airfields and defensive positions. A Wehrmacht supply officer provided complete inventories of remaining fuel and ammunition stocks. This cooperation had value beyond immediate military intelligence. The information gathered from recovered prisoners helped Allied planners understand the complete collapse of German logistics, the locations of remaining military assets, and the state of civilian morale. It also revealed the extent to which Nazi propaganda had lied to German soldiers about Allied intentions. The contrast with earlier interrogations was notable. German prisoners captured in 1944, before experiencing American medical treatment, had been resistant and suspicious. They provided only name, rank, and serial number as required by the Geneva Convention. Interrogators had to work hard to extract useful information, but prisoners who had recovered in American hospitals were different. They trusted their captors and responded accordingly. Major Hendricks noted this pattern in his reports to higher headquarters. Enemy wounded who receive prompt and professional medical treatment become cooperative sources of intelligence, he wrote. The humanitarian treatment of casualties has intelligence value beyond its obvious moral and legal justification. The scope of this intelligence gathering was significant. By late April, intelligence sections had interviewed more than 10,000 recovered German POWs. The information compiled from these interviews provided a comprehensive picture of the German military's final collapse. It confirmed that organized resistance was impossible, that supply systems had ceased to function, and that German forces retained no meaningful combat capability. But the most valuable intelligence was psychological. Interrogators learned that German soldiers had fundamentally misunderstood American motivations and capabilities. They had believed Nazi propaganda about American weakness and barbarism. The professional treatment they received in American hospitals shattered these beliefs completely. This psychological shift would prove crucial in the occupation period that followed Germany's surrender. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. The war in Europe would end in 8 days. American medics had treated more than 20,000 German wounded in April alone. Each recovered prisoner represented not just a life saved, but a mind changed. A German soldier who now understood that the Allied cause had been just and that American values of humanity and professionalism were genuine. April 1945, Washington, D.C. The Office of the Surgeon General compiled final reports on medical innovations developed during the war. The data showed extraordinary progress in trauma care, surgical techniques, and medical logistics. Much of this innovation had come from treating both American and enemy casualties under battlefield conditions. Blood plasma was perhaps the most significant advance. Before the war, whole blood transfusions required careful matching and refrigeration. Plasma, the liquid component of blood without cells, could be dried, stored, and reconstituted when needed. This innovation saved thousands of lives. By April 1945, American medical units had administered more than 500,000 plasma transfusions. German wounded received plasma as routinely as American casualties. Antibiotics revolutionized infection treatment. Sulfur drugs, introduced in the late 1930s, prevented many bacterial infections. Penicillin, mass-produced by American pharmaceutical companies from 1943 onward, was even more effective. Wounds that would have been fatal from infection in World War I now healed with antibiotic treatment. German prisoners benefited from these drugs as much as American soldiers. Surgical techniques advanced dramatically. The high velocity of modern weapons created complex traumatic injuries. Surgeons developed new methods for repairing shattered bones, torn organs, and massive tissue damage. Triage protocols improved, allowing medical personnel to prioritize treatment effectively even when casualties were overwhelming. These innovations, tested on battlefields across Europe, would transform civilian medical practice after the war. The statistics demonstrated unprecedented success. The overall mortality rate for wounded soldiers who reached medical treatment was approximately 4% in World War II compared to 8% in World War I. This improvement reflected better surgical techniques, antibiotics, blood plasma, and rapid evacuation. German POWs treated by American medical units had mortality rates comparable to American casualties, a remarkable achievement given battlefield conditions. Medical logistics represented an invisible but crucial innovation. The United States had developed an industrial approach to medical supply, producing standardized medical kits that could be shipped anywhere in the world. Surgical instruments were mass-produced to precise specifications. Hospital equipment was designed for rapid deployment and mobility. This systematic approach to medical logistics was uniquely American, reflecting the nation's industrial capacity and organizational expertise. By war's end, the U.S. Army Medical Corps had treated more than 1 million casualties. The lessons learned about trauma care, logistics, triage, and battlefield surgery would influence medical practice for decades. The treatment of German wounded, far from being a burden, had provided additional data and experience that improved medical techniques for everyone. Humanity and medical science had advanced together, proving that mercy and effectiveness were not contradictory but complementary. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended. Across Germany, millions of soldiers laid down their arms and entered captivity. Among them were more than 100,000 men who had been wounded and treated in American field hospitals. These men carried with them a powerful truth. Americans had saved their lives when they expected death. This experience would shape the post-war relationship between Germany and the United States in ways that military planners could not have predicted. The seeds of reconciliation had been planted in field hospitals across Germany during April and May 1945. The immediate post-war period was chaotic. Germany lay in ruins. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. The Allied occupation faced enormous challenges, but former Wehrmacht soldiers who had been treated by American medics became informal ambassadors for cooperation with occupation authorities. They told their families and communities that Americans could be trusted, that they were fair and professional. Historical analysis confirms this pattern. West Germany's rapid rehabilitation and integration into the Western Alliance during the late 1940s and early 1950s was facilitated by positive German attitudes toward Americans. These attitudes had multiple sources, but the treatment of POWs played a significant role. German veterans remembered American fairness and contrasted it with Soviet brutality. The contrast was stark and deliberate in German memory. More than 1 million German POWs died in Soviet captivity. Hundreds of thousands remained imprisoned until the mid-1950s. Those who returned told stories of starvation, forced labor, and systematic cruelty. Against this backdrop, American treatment of prisoners appeared not just humane but extraordinarily generous. Statistics documented the difference. Of approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by American forces, the mortality rate in captivity was less than 1%. This compared to a mortality rate exceeding 30% in Soviet captivity. These numbers were widely known in post-war Germany and influenced public opinion profoundly. The medical treatment of wounded prisoners became part of this larger narrative. German families whose sons or fathers had been saved by American medics felt gratitude that transcended political ideology. This gratitude created a foundation for the German-American alliance that would define the Cold War era. The Marshall Plan, NATO membership, and West Germany's integration into the Western Alliance all benefited from the positive attitudes created in part by the humanitarian treatment of prisoners in 1945. By treating wounded German soldiers with the same professionalism and care given to American casualties, U.S. Army medics had done more than fulfill their legal and moral obligations. They had demonstrated American values in the most convincing way possible, through actions, not words. That demonstration would echo through decades of German-American cooperation and friendship. May 1945 through 1947. Across America and Germany, the human cost of war became apparent. Physical wounds healed, but psychological scars remained. Both American medics and German patients carried memories of the war's final weeks. Captain Robert Morrison returned to his medical practice in Ohio in late 1945. He rarely spoke about his wartime service. When asked, he would say only that he had done his duty, but his wife noticed changes. He worked longer hours, took special care with difficult patients, and never turned away anyone who needed treatment. The war had reinforced his commitment to medicine as a calling, not just a profession. Similar patterns appeared across the medical corps. Doctors and medics who had served in field hospitals returned to civilian practice with enhanced skills and deeper commitment to their profession. They had seen medicine's power to transcend hatred and ideology. Many became leaders in their communities, bringing home not just medical expertise but also lessons about human dignity and professional ethics. The psychological impact on German veterans was complex. Many struggled with guilt over their role in the war. Some dealt with trauma from combat experiences. But those who had been treated in American hospitals often expressed a different perspective. They had experienced mercy when they expected death. This experience provided a counterweight to the shame of defeat and the horror of Holocaust revelations. Werner Schmidt, who had been treated at the 67th Field Hospital for leg wounds, later wrote about his experience. When the American doctor saved my leg, he saved more than that. He showed me that not everything we had been taught was true, that there was another way to live, with dignity, respect, and professionalism. I tried to remember that lesson for the rest of my life. Statistics cannot fully capture this human dimension. Official records show that approximately 150,000 German soldiers received medical treatment from American forces during the war's final months, but each statistic represented an individual life saved, a family that received their son or father back, a person who carried forward the memory of American humanity. The cost to American medical personnel was also real. They had worked under tremendous stress, often for months without relief. Many suffered from exhaustion and trauma. Some struggled with the moral complexity of treating enemies while their comrades died. But they had done their duty, and in doing so had demonstrated the best of American values. The human cost of this service was high, but the legacy was enduring. The present day. In hospitals and medical schools across America and Germany, the lessons of April 1945 continue to resonate. The treatment of German wounded by American medics has become a case study in medical ethics, military professionalism, and the power of humanitarian values, even in wartime. The Geneva Convention principles that guided American medics in 1945 remain the foundation of military medical practice. All modern militaries train their medical personnel to treat enemy wounded with the same care given to friendly forces. This standard, tested and proven in April 1945, has become universal. The legacy extends beyond military medicine. The American approach to treating prisoners, humanely, professionally, without regard to their role in the war, influenced international humanitarian law and the development of human rights standards after World War II. The Nuremberg trials established accountability for war crimes, but they also established that professional conduct, even toward enemies, was both legally required and morally essential. In Germany, the memory of American treatment of prisoners contributed to the development of post-war democracy. The contrast between American fairness and Nazi brutality reinforced democratic values. Former soldiers who had experienced American professionalism became advocates for Western-style democracy and the rule of law. This cultural shift was crucial to West Germany's transformation into a stable, democratic ally. The medical innovations developed during the war, plasma, antibiotics, improved surgical techniques, continued to save lives long after 1945. These advances benefited all of humanity, not just the military. The systematic approach to medical logistics pioneered by the U.S. Army Medical Corps influenced civilian medical systems worldwide. The emphasis on rapid treatment, efficient triage, and evidence-based protocols became standard in emergency medicine. But perhaps the most important legacy is the simplest. In the darkest moments of history's deadliest war, American medics demonstrated that humanity could survive even in combat. They showed that professional ethics and military necessity were not contradictory. They proved that treating enemies with dignity and respect was not weakness, but strength. The story of April 1945, when American medics saved their enemies' lives, reminds us that even in war, choices matter. The choice to treat wounded Germans was legally required, strategically advantageous, and morally right. But it was still a choice, made by individual doctors, medics, and nurses who understood that their duty extended beyond nationality and ideology. They chose mercy, they chose professionalism, they chose humanity. That choice echoes still in field hospitals around the world where medical personnel continue to treat all wounded with equal care. The lesson of April 1945 remains clear. The truest victory is not over enemies, but over hatred itself.